Did you guys know that the Moondrop Aria has like a very close sibling known as the Moondrop Aria Snow Edition? I mean, it's newer, of course, but you know, here it is. It's like the same thing, but actually not. Slightly different. Let's talk about it. Alright, now before we dig a little bit deeper into the review about these guys, I gotta put a few things out there. First of all, these were sent out for me for review, but you know, this won't affect my review in any way, shape, or form. Everything out in here is gonna be my own personal opinion. Also, this is gonna be more of a gaming review as usual, where we'll be touching more on like the audiophile aspects for like to know why this is like any good at games and whatnot. And for this video, we will be comparing it to the original Arias, because while they are essentially the same thing in build and looks, except for like in color, I guess, they are a little bit different in sound and you know technology inside, and that's what affected the sound. So, you know, with that being said, let's get started. Alright, I still have my old Aria box, and from the looks of it, I think the new one is the same waifu. I'm not entirely sure, but she's still pretty regardless. Anyway, inside our snow-themed box, we're gonna get the IMs, of course, which are also snow-themed. You get some spin tips, regular tips, and more regular tips, a carrying case, a cable, and some paperworks. Starting with the cable, it's a simple and clean unbraided cable that is nice and thick and durable, with an angled 3.5mm jack, a rather simplistic splitter, and of course ear hooks with 2-pin connectors. The IEMs themselves have a very nice all-metal build with a fancy snowflake design, but the shape of it is essentially the same as the original Aria, which is good because the inside build is also going to be very nice. It's going to have the same connectors on top, which are 2-pin connectors, and of course the nozzles are metal with metal grills. Having the same build and design means having the exact same fit as the original Arias, which is actually a good thing because the Arias themselves are very comfortable and you can wear them for very long periods of time, as they're not too big or not too small and they don't stick out of your ear too much. The only time I ever felt discomfort was when I picked the wrong ear tip size, so your mileage will vary depending on the size and shape of your ears and your ear tip choice, but either of the Arias should fit most people's ears very well. Alright, now the Moondrop Aria Snow is essentially the Moondrop Aria, but reskinned with a slightly modified like driver inside, which just very ever so slightly changes the sound, and whether this is like good or bad depends on from person to person. Even then, the difference in sound between the Aria Snow and the Aria is very, very minimal, and for some people you might just not even notice it. But those who are more discerning may actually like be able to hear something different. For me, it started as like something's a bit different, like you barely notice it. You know something's different, but you're not sure what it is until you like took a deep dive into it, which we're gonna do now. So, you know, as many would know if you like are into the Arias or you've read or seen a lot of videos about the Arias, they have a slight V-shaped sound signature, so you know, like a little bit more bass, a little bit more of the highs, and a slight recession in the mids, while still retaining a very clean, smooth sound with a pretty nice stage and, you know, pretty good imaging for what they are. That's why the Arias are like, you know, a bang for your buck deal. The Snow Editions take that same formula and mildly adjust it at like the bass level, particularly in the lower sub-bass levels, and at like the little mid-range area, ever so slightly, but it's just enough where, you know, I would personally notice it, but like I said, many of you may not, but it still will affect it, especially like in games, but even then ever so slightly, but we're still going to talk about it. Now then, the Aria Snow at the low range is very similar to like, you know, the Arias like I mentioned earlier, where you actually get a very good amount of bass. It's not like, you know, bass head level, but still a very adequate amount that most people would enjoy. You get a decent thump, you get a decent punch. It's like, it's there, it's good. But compared to the Arias, you're going to get less of that lower bass region, so, you know, that thump at the very low end isn't going to be quite as there, and when it's like more rumbling kind of sounds, that gives kind of like body to sounds, especially like when combined with other sounds in like the sound range, you will feel less of that sense of size and body ever so slightly, but it's definitely noticeable if you're like switching back and forth between the two. Now this might be done to essentially enhance the mids, because the mids on the Aria Snow are slightly more boosted or slightly less recessed than they are on the Arias. The Arias have, you know, that, you know, it's got the V-shape-ish kind of sound, so it's got a slight recession, and that mids is smoothed in and out a little bit. With the Aria Snow, it does a little less of that. So something I did notice, this was probably the more noticeable bit, was that the mids, it got my attention a little bit more on the Aria Snow version versus on the regular version. So I do think in the mid-range, you're going to get a little bit more clarity, a little bit more of those details, and it seems that that slight slightly less recession, that slight, I guess, push in this part makes them just a little bit more bright or something like that, you know. But the body from the bass does affect how I perceive the mids, especially in the lower mids, I think, when there are sounds that use both those at the same time. So it's not quite as full, but it is more detailed, if that makes sense. The sound in the mid-range for this Snow Edition is essentially slightly more clear than it is smooth, whereas on the original Aria, it is slightly more smooth than it is clear. Moving on to the highs on the Aria Snow, it's not too different from the regular Arias, and that's not a bad thing because the highs are essentially very smooth, clean, but clear all at the same time. And the range of them I wouldn't say is like super really high up there, but on the bright side, no pun intended, it doesn't get sharp, and that's a good thing. And I think due to the way that the mids are tuned on the Aria Snow, being with that slight boost over like the regular Arias, it works well, and it just helps bring out the details ever so slightly. But even then, I think they weren't too different from the regular Arias. Like, I don't know if there was much of a change. I did see some graphs online, and it says like they did like tune down the highs a little bit for whatever reason. They said it was to like adjust it with like the rest of the sound signature and the new diaphragm and whatnot. But I think they were just trying to keep like the highs very close to the Arias, because honestly I didn't notice too much of a difference. How they work together with the mids is the main difference, I suppose. But even then, it's it's not too noticeable of a difference, and I think that's good because clean, clear highs that don't go too high, so it don't pierce your ears. Always good in my book. Now moving on to Soundstage and imaging, I'd say it's about the same. Like, that's not a bad thing because you got a pretty good size, so it has more of, more width than there's depth. And, headroom is just whatever. It's just okay. Though, I feel like the imaging on the Moondrop Aria Snow Edition is ever so slightly better. Like, the teeniest tiny bit better. But, with all this considered, like, with the sound difference that's ever so slightly different, and, Soundstage imaging being ever so slightly different, well, more in the imaging, I guess. One would expect this would, it would affect how it does in gameplay, especially like for like competitive games, considering that there is, a little less, teeny bit less bass and more mids. But honestly, in my actual, application of it in games, my experience felt almost exactly the same. And that's not necessarily like a bad thing, because the Arias do well in basically any genre of game, whether it's like a competitive game or a non-competitive game, open world or not. Like in competitive shooters, that's where I wanted to focus on things the most, because there is a slight difference in the mids where it's a little bit more boosted, giving you a bit, teeny bit more detail. And this should essentially help you out in tracking people. But from what I can tell, it's like the difference that you can get out of it, the improved ability to track people, is so minuscule compared to the regular Arias that I don't think most people would notice an improvement in their ability to track people. I do think it does bring your attention to those sounds a little bit better than the Arias, but like by such a very small margin, it's it's almost negligible. But I guess if you're like a really try-hard sweat who still would like the Aria sound and prefers to have some bass regardless of what you're using, then I do think this would still technically benefit you, because a person who's into more competitive stuff and is very competitive about it, I'm granted you probably wouldn't be using the Arias, you'd be using something else, but if you're that kind of competitive person who really likes the Arias and wanted a slight, ever so teeny edge, you will probably take it. So there is that. Now you may think that like on the non-competitive side, there's more open world kind of side, this will be a slight hit, but honestly I wouldn't say like the Aria Snow took a hit, just because like it has less of that lower bass region boost. It still had a pretty good time there in like non-competitive open world games, and it felt like I was still using like the regular Aria, so that's good. So what does this mean about my overall opinion about like the Aria Snow Edition for like gaming overall, considering what we know now? Well, like, if you were to ask me if the Aria Snows were any better than the regular Arias for gaming, I would say, even then, with such little differences, technically, yes. While the differences were more easily noticeable when you're like comparing them like music-wise, in games your experience is more than just focusing on sound. You're focusing on like the visuals as well, and actually playing the game. So then you're not purely focused on the sound, so it's much easier to miss a lot of the differences when you're actually playing the game. But if I were to actually break it down and how it will actually affect you, I do think the Aria Snow is ever so slightly, like the teeniest bit better than the Arias if you're going to be playing more competitive games, just because of the way it's tuned. The sounds are just more present in the ranges that you want them to be present, namely the mids and the highs, I suppose, for those type of situations. But it's very, very, very little in terms of its difference. But if you're like a tryhard or like a sweat who really loves the sound of the Arias, and you just wanted it to be slightly more tuned for competitive shooters, then, you know, the Moondrop Aria Snow is where it's at. For those of you who are like normies, who don't take things too seriously, you can honestly pick between these two and be very happy with both. Granted, I do think if you have them next to each other and got to try them both, you will be able to discern if you'll like one more than the other, probably because you'll be listening to them for music. But if you're going to be using it for games, and your concern is if they'll, you know, be good for either kind of games, I think you'll be fine regardless of what game you pick. They are generally more tuned to be like good for like any kind of game. They're not like super mega ultra good for shooters over like non-shooters or non-competitive stuff. They're just a good all-around, you know, happy as you can be in any kind of game you play. The difference between them for most people, I guess, out there would be then aesthetics. For audiophiles, you know, you'll care about the sound and you'll probably be on a different channel. But for most of the normal people out there, I think at this point you'd just be choosing them for the looks and the accessories that they come with, in which case like the Aria Snow wins in that place, at least in the accessories department. When it comes to looks, you really depend on person to person. Anyway, yeah, that's pretty much all I have about like the Moondrop Aria Snow edition. They're just ever so slightly different in sound than the Moondrop Arias, in a way that makes them ever so slightly better than the Moondrop Arias for, you know, in competitive shooter kind of situations. Which I guess does mean that the Arias are ever so slightly better for non-competitive, but the difference in there is so close that it might as well not really be much of a difference at all. So I do think these things will be really good in non-competitive regardless. But those discerning in sound, like I said many times, I think I'm just repeating myself at this point. If you're going for the Moondrop Arias because you like it for competitive shooters, but you want it to be slightly better for competitive shooters and competitive kind of games where listening is important for tracking people, the Snows are going to do it for you. Those of you who can't discern sound that very well, you know, it's all down to looks and accessories, I guess, at that point. This is just how things go, you know, they're just so similar. But for someone like me, I can't notice a difference, so it does matter to me. But, you know, like I said, to you guys out there, maybe it doesn't, but now you know. They are slightly different. So, you know, regardless, if you do want to purchase them, I will have a link in the description. And that link is like going to be, it's going to give me a kickback, helps me run this channel essentially. And this video did help you out. Like the video, subscribe for more content, notification bell if you want to know when I'm posting next. And that being said, see you guys next time.